Welcome back, friends. So, when we are talking about the English Romanticism, I thought it very relevant that to talk about American Romanticism as well, although they are not interconnected. The British or the English Romanticism owes to the European ideals and particularly the French Revolution, the idea of liberty, equality, fraternity, the slogan of French Revolution, and also the publication of the lyrical ballads which heralded the beginning of English Romanticism. American Romanticism flourished a little later than in Europe. The designated period is 1825 to 1865. 1825 to 1865, which see the end coincides with the end of the Civil War. The period is also called the American Renaissance and the age of transcendentalism. At the core, at the center of American Romanticism. The key names are the Transcendentalists, Emerson, Thoreau, Walt Whitman, and then we have another category of the dark romantics, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne. All these writers are immensely important. So, in this week 5, we will be talking a lot about these names and many more. Emerson and Whitman referred to America as a poem which needed to be written. Whitman called the expression of individual identity quite similar or akin to national identity. Therefore, so much of emphasis on American individualism. It sort of revolted against the age of reason and rationality and scientific spirit of the age. They felt, the transcendentalists felt that reason played an important role in the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence. After all, Thomas Paine and his pamphlet Common Sense, which was published in 1776, is a work that challenged the authority of the British government and the monarchy, and is completely, it owes its allegiance to the age of reason. So, reason, control, conformity, order, rationality, all these are concepts of reason, the age of reason, whereas Romanticism is all about imagination, individualism, emotion and spontaneity. As we know that Romantic literature was also always very subjective, saturated with emotional intensity, and again the idea, the emphasis on the common man could be the hero. And this is found in Walt Whitman, who lived between 1817 to 1892. Walt Whitman, the great 19th century American poet, in his Songs of Myself, who is known for his Song of Myself, but most importantly for Leaves of Grass, where he declared a poet's manifesto, that is 1855 Leaves of Grass manifesto, that the new American poet would and should create new forms and subject matter for poetry, rejecting conventional language and rhyme. Please look at the slide here, Leaves of Grass. Look at the poem here, and again look how close he is to William Wordsworth, in the sense that his attention is on a child's imagination, individualism, rustic rural life closer to nature. A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition out of hopeful green stuff woven, or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name somewhere in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Continuation. Or I guess the grass itself a child, the produce babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white. Canuck, Takano, congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive them the same. Equality, one of the foremost poets to include so many, to be inclusive of so many. Look at another poem by Whitman, Dalliance of the Eagles, 1880, and look at the imagery again. Skirting the river road, my forenoon walk, my rest, skyward in the air, a sudden muffled sound, the dalliance of the eagles, the rushing amorous contact high in space together, the clinching interlocking claws, a living fierce gyrating wheel, four beating wings, two beaks, a swirling mass tight grappling, in tumbling, turning, clustering loops, straight downward falling, till o'er the river poise, the twain yet one, a moment's lull, a motionless still balance in the air, then parting, talons loosing, upward again, on slow firm pinions slanting, the separate diverse flight, she hers, he his, pursuing. I also want you to look at Wallace Stevens, who is a modernist poet, and look at his ideas here. In the far south, the sun of autumn is passing, like Walt Whitman walking along a ruddy shore. He is singing and chanting the things that are part of him, the worlds that were and will be, death and day. Nothing is final, he chants, no man shall see the end. His beard is full of fire and his staff is a leaping flame. So, these are the, this is the kind of honor given to Walt Whitman and his ideas, the themes. Other writers of this period of American Romanticism are William Bryant, Washington Irving, the writer of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, Longfellow, Margaret Fuller, James Fenimore Cooper, who gave us the noble savage in his Natty Bumppo novels, and of course, the great Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived between 1803 to 1882, officially ushered in American Romanticism, a leading exponent of transcendentalism, and his works influenced people such as Thoreau, Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Also George Eliot and Nietzsche in Europe. His seminal essay Nature bears testimony to his romantic worldview. He expresses several, and nature expresses several of his ideas on individualism, where he believes that nature is perceptible only to the eye and heart of the child and someone who has retained the spirit of infancy. Nature is part of God. Emerson says the whole of nature is a metaphor of the human mind. This relation between the mind and matter is not fancied by some poets, but stands in the will of God and so is free to be known by all men. He also wrote The American Scholar, the great essay which was delivered at Phi Beta Kappa Society in 1837. Here, and this is important, he called for a distinctively American writing free from European influence. See, this is important, a watershed time or era or moment in American literature. American writing should have a distinct American flavor. It was a call for Americans to trust their instincts and individuality and act as representatives, American representatives to the world. The major influence on the scholar included here, according to Emerson, not only nature but also the mind of the past. So, in this way you can connect him to T.S. Eliot's tradition and the individual talent, that everything is in a state of continuum. Eliot also suggests that the individual writer should subordinate himself to the mind of Europe, to tradition. For Emerson, the mind of the past being restrictive is exactly what contemporary writers must transcend and express the reality of their own period. There is one man, one O in capital, M in capital, there is one man according to Emerson. And the final influence on the scholar is action. Without it, he is not yet man. Without it, thought can never ripen into truth. Emerson wrote Self-Reliance, another essay where he said, whoso would be a man must be a non-conformist, so therefore individualism. Remember that. So, American scholar, Self-Reliance, Nature, three great works by Emerson. Leaves of Grass by Whitman, and also his several other poems as well. And then another great writer of the same school, Henry David Thoreau, who lived between 1817 and 1862, an essayist, philosopher, poet, but also a mystic. He was a keen observer of nature, a lover of solitude, an exponent of the simple life. He famously said, that government is best which governs not at all, which is quoted, which is a line from his Civil Disobedience in 1849. Thoreau's Walden in 1854 is a template for an authentic life that can be lived if one leads a simple life free of materialism. In his writings, the writer becomes one with nature, and the ecological and the spiritual unite. We will be discussing more of these works in our subsequent classes when we go deeper into American literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived between 1804 to 1864, is another exponent of the American Romantic period. He drew upon Emerson's theories of individualism and also European theories of enlightenment, and also Coleridge's view on imagination. Along with Herman Melville, he derided the twin issues of mechanism and consumerism in American society. He was also obsessed with the themes of sin and guilt, as is best reflected in his The Scarlet Letter. We will be talking about that great novel also in detail soon. And then of course we have Edgar Allan Poe, the representative of the so-called dark romanticism. Poe lived from 1809 to 1849. He is a poet, short story writer, writers of suspense and thrilling stories, and also a critic, an occasional critic, nevertheless a critic, a literary critic. Great works include The Fall of the House of Usher, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Telltale Heart, and of course The Raven. Along with Melville and Hawthorne, he was a dark romantic. He followed the Gothic tradition that we have been talking about in some of our earlier classes. So, creepy symbols, horrific themes, psychological effects of guilt and sin, terrors lurking in the shadows, all these are parts of Poe's oeuvre. Poe followed believed in the close analysis of a work, and in his essay Philosophy of Composition, which was published in 1846, he explains the process of writing in The Raven. He also explains that instead of working in a fine frenzy of ecstatic intuition, a poet chooses a consistent emotional atmosphere that takes primacy over incident, character, and versification. In his The Poetic Principle, which was published in 1850, he asserts that aesthetic appreciation rather than didactic purpose was of chief literary value. Remember that, and how this was to influence the aesthetics, the decadent movement. Poe also believed that the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetical topic in the world. Poe reviewed Nathaniel Hawthorne's tales and offered his celebrated views on the genre of prose fiction. Poe was not too fond of the allegorical writing, but his vision was darker and more mystic. Here is an example from Raven, his 1845 poem. Please look at it. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. It is some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in that bleak December. and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my book's surcase of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now to still the beatings of my heart I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is and nothing more." And then also look at his ballad, Annabel Lee of 1849. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. In tale writing, Nathaniel Hawthorne Poe believed that Hawthorne's lack of originality and his dependence on allegory limits him as a writer. So, Poe, again a non-conformist, one of the greatest examples of a non-conformist American writers of the Romantic period. So, the primary features of American Romanticism, the celebration of individualism comes first, celebration of or expression of deep emotions, and also belief or close proximity with the nature. The Romantics asserted the importance of the individual, the unique, even the eccentric, as is reflected in Poe. And they oppose the character typology of neoclassical period or drama. Most important contribution is individualism. Individualism can also lead to isolation, and as we all understand. Therefore, as Emerson worries in The American Scholar, he warns us or cautions us against imitation and parroting. He looks inward to find divine essence, which he claims we all share. Thoreau also isolates and purifies himself at Walden Pond, and Poe is habitually aristocratic, though in real life he wasn't, but he portrays aristocratic characters, hypersensitive young men in Gothic circumstances. And then you have Melville, who has the greatest individualistic hero, Captain Ahab, aboard Pickard in Moby Dick. Okay? He is Homeric, he is Shakespearean in his grandeur. Here is an excerpt from Melville's Moby Dick. Please take a look at it. Ahab's description. Please look at the slide here. He looked like a man cut away from the stake. This is our hero. When the fire has overrunningly wasted all the limbs without consuming them or taking away one particle from their compacted aged robustness. His whole high, broad form seemed made of solid bronze and shaped in an unalterable mold like Cellini's cast Perseus. Look at the description, it continues, threading its way out from among his grey hairs and continuing right down one side of his tawny Scotch face and neck till it disappeared in his clothing. You saw a slender rod-like mark, lividly whitish. It resembled that perpendicular seam, sometimes made in the straight, lofty trunk of a great tree, when the upper lightning tearingly darts down it, and without wrenching a single twig, peels and grooves out the bark from top to bottom, air running off into the soil, leaving the tree still greenly alive but branded. Whether that mark was born with him, or whether it was the scar left by some desperate wound, no one could certainly say. A great description of a great hero, individualism. Other instances of individualism and uniqueness you find in Emily Dickinson. She did not go public by publishing her verse, and this is one of the, so we are going to do Dickinson also in detail, but remember, one of the foremost writers in American literature. Going back to Whitman, he embraces the democratic masses, yes, but he also calls his major work as Song of Myself. So, belief in individualism lurks or stays at the center of all great American writing. Sincerity, spontaneity, faith in emotion. Belief in natural goodness of man as portrayed in Cooper's figuration of the noble savage. Belief that what is special in a man is to be valued over what is representative, not a type, but special. Delight in self-analysis. Affirmation of the values of democracy and the freedom of the individual. So, thank you very much, and we will continue with more on American literature in our subsequent classes.